When you think of pirates, what comes to mind? Wild, lawless rebels of the sea? Men and women who answered to no one but the call of the horizon? But what if I told you that behind the chaos and the cutlasses, there was a secret code, a set of rules these outlaws swore by? Yes, the infamous pirate code. But was it real, or just another myth spun by storytellers in Hollywood? Did these sea bandits live by laws, or were they truly creatures of chaos? Tonight, we dive deep beneath the waves of legend and history to unravel the truth behind the pirate code, the rules that governed the unruly and the free. Strap in, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see pirates forever. Imagine the endless horizon ahead, the creaking timbers of a weather-beaten ship groaning under the relentless sun. The salty sea breeze whips through tattered sails as a ragtag crew of men and women gathers on deck. The air is thick with tension and the scent of salt, sweat, and danger. These aren't just any sailors. They are pirates, outlaws, rebels, and thieves. But they are also bound together by something far more intricate than shared loot, a code. This is where most legends begin, the famous pirate code, said to be a set of rules all pirates followed, a law among lawlessness. But was there really such a thing? Or was it just a clever story made up to romanticize ruthless criminals? For centuries, the image of the pirate has been painted as one of chaos and anarchy, swashbuckling rogues with no respect for rules, living only for freedom and gold. Yet, hidden beneath this wild facade lies a surprising truth. Many pirate crews did operate under written or spoken codes, structured agreements that governed behavior, shared responsibilities, and divided spoils. The origins of pirate codes. Our best window into these rules comes from the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the so-called Golden Age of piracy. This era brought some of history's most infamous pirates, Bartholomew Roberts, Henry Morgan, Black Sam Bellamy, and others whose names echo through time. One of the earliest and most detailed sets of pirate articles comes from Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart. Roberts commanded one of the most successful pirate fleets and is famous not only for his daring raids, but also for insisting his crew abide by a strict code of conduct. In his articles, Roberts outlined rules about everything from how loot was divided to punishments for stealing from fellow pirates. These rules weren't just arbitrary, they were born from hard experience. Pirate life was brutal and dangerous. Every man and woman on board depended on each other's trust and cooperation to survive. Without some form of order, mutiny, chaos, and destruction would have been inevitable. Even before Roberts, other pirate captains had their own codes, often passed down orally, varying from ship to ship. The key was consent. Every crew member typically agreed to these articles before setting sail. The codes ensured fairness in a world where official justice was often absent. What did these codes look like? Though the exact content varied, many pirate codes shared common themes. Equal shares. Loot was divided fairly among the crew, sometimes with extra shares for the captain and officers, but generally promoting a sense of equality. Discipline and order. Rules about weapons, fights, and conduct kept the peace on board, an essential measure on a cramped ship. Compensation. Provisions for injured pirates, including pay for lost limbs or wounds, underscored a practical approach to care and loyalty. Democratic decisions. Many pirate crews voted on important matters, including electing captains or deciding on targets. It's important to understand that these codes were not laws in the traditional sense. There was no king or government enforcing them. Instead, they were social contracts created by necessity, agreements forged in the fire of survival and mutual benefit. The skeptic's view, a myth born of romanticism, but not all historians are convinced these codes were widespread or strictly followed. Some argue the pirate code is more myth than reality, a convenient story to sanitize the brutal and lawless nature of piracy for popular consumption. In reality, pirates were a diverse group, some democratic and orderly, others chaotic and violent. The degree to which codes were enforced likely varied widely. After all, many pirate crews were made up of desperate, unruly men driven by greed and survival instincts rather than idealistic principles. However, the surviving written codes, like those of Roberts, Edward Lowe, and others, provide compelling evidence that some rules did exist, and they mattered. Picture yourself on a restless sea. The ship's deck rocks beneath your feet as waves crash against the hull, salty spray stinging your face. The sun is setting, casting fiery streaks across the endless horizon. Around you, the crew moves with practiced efficiency, yet beneath their gruff exteriors lies a delicate tension. They are pirates, outlaws by the law of nations, yet their lives depend on an invisible, fragile web of rules, the pirate code. For centuries, tales of pirates have been painted with broad strokes, ruthless, lawless marauders driven by greed and bloodlust. Movies and novels often portray them as rebels who answered only to their whims. But beneath this vivid myth lies a lesser-known reality. Pirates lived by a set of rules, a code that shaped everything from how treasure was divided to how disputes were settled. These rules, whether written or oral, were the glue that held their dangerous world together. To understand the pirate code, we must look beyond the romanticized skull and crossbones and delve into the brutal world of 17th and 18th century maritime life. The golden age of piracy, roughly spanning 1650 to 1730, was a time when the world's oceans became battlegrounds for desperate men and women seeking fortune beyond the rigid confines of empire and law. Pirates were often former sailors, privateers, or even escaped slaves, bound by a shared rejection of traditional authority, but bound nonetheless by necessity to cooperate. Life at sea was unforgiving. Storms, starvation, injury, and enemy attacks were everyday threats. Trust was scarce. Mutiny was a constant risk. Without laws or a sovereign to turn to, pirates needed their own system, their own social contract to survive. Thus, the pirate code emerged as a pragmatic answer, a flexible but enforceable set of agreements that balanced freedom with order. This code wasn't imposed from above, but created collectively, often agreed upon by a vote of the crew before a voyage. One of the most famous and well-documented pirate codes belonged to Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart. Born John Roberts, he quickly became one of the most successful and feared pirates of his time, capturing over 400 ships in just a few years. Roberts' Code, first documented in 1720, consisted of 11 articles outlining the conduct expected from his crew. Unlike the popular image of pirates as chaotic and violent, Roberts' Code reveals a surprisingly organized and disciplined society. Here are some highlights from Roberts' Pirate Code. Equal shares. Each crew member, from captain to the lowliest deckhand, received an equal share of the loot, except for a few officers, who got slightly more as compensation for risk and responsibility. This sense of fairness fostered loyalty and minimized disputes, Weapons regulation. Pirates could not carry firearms or cutlasses below decks, except during battle or emergencies. This rule aimed to prevent sudden violence and maintain peace on board. Compensation for injuries. Pirates wounded in action were compensated handsomely. For example, losing a right arm or a leg would earn a man a fixed amount of gold, reflecting the harsh realities of their dangerous profession. No gambling. Gambling was forbidden while at sea to avoid disputes and distractions. Respect for the captain. The captain was to be obeyed during battle, but otherwise was accountable to the crew and could be deposed if he acted against their interests. Robert's code was so detailed that it included stipulations for cleanliness and even religious observance. While some of these rules may sound surprising, they paint a picture of a crew striving for a balance between freedom and order. Roberts wasn't alone in formalizing such rules. Many pirate captains drafted their own versions, often tailored to their crew's specific needs and personalities. Captain Edward Lowe's articles included clauses forbidding theft from fellow pirates and detailed punishments for breaking the code, such as marooning. Henry Morgan's crew reportedly had codes that emphasized discipline and fair distribution of loot, and even required mutual defense agreements among crew members. Though the exact wording and strictness of these codes varied, the underlying principles were remarkably consistent: fairness, discipline, mutual protection, and democratic decision-making, oral traditions, and the social contract. Not all pirate codes were written. Many crews relied on oral agreements, passed down through tradition and enforced by peer pressure. These unwritten codes governed everyday life aboard ships: when and how loot was divided, how decisions were made, and what behavior was tolerated. The fact that pirates often elected their captains and quartermasters through democratic votes was itself a radical departure from naval or merchant ships, where authority was rigid and hierarchical. This democratic spirit was enshrined in their codes, granting the crew a voice in critical decisions, including whether to engage in battle or which ports to raid. The pirate code was less about law enforcement and more about survival and trust. Without a sovereign authority, a pirate crew was its own society, fragile but fiercely independent. These codes were the invisible contracts that made this possible. Skepticism and the myth of the pirate code. Despite the surviving documents, some historians argue the pirate code has been romanticized or exaggerated. After all, many pirates were ruthless criminals, prone to violence, treachery, and betrayal. Some contend that while codes existed, they were often ignored or broken. Pirates' reputations for cruelty and lawlessness were earned for a reason. The real picture was likely a messy blend of order and chaos, with discipline enforced unevenly depending on the captain, crew, and situation. Additionally, the concept of the pirate code has been amplified by novels like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island and Hollywood films, which shaped the modern image of pirates as honorable rogues bound by a secret, noble code. The pirate code in context, a revolutionary form of governance. In a time when most people lived under strict monarchies or rigid class systems, pirate ships operated with surprising levels of democracy and social justice. Their codes reflected a collective bargaining agreement, a proto-constitution that ensured fair treatment and minimized infighting. Pirates shared the spoils more equally than the navies or merchant ships they attacked, where captains and officers often took the lion's share. They compensated for injuries, offered voting rights, and sometimes even enforced rules about food and drink rationing. In this sense, the pirate code was not just a survival mechanism, but a radical social experiment, one that questioned traditional authority and hierarchy. Immersive anecdote: a pirate's life under the code. Let me paint a vivid scene for you. It's a humid, restless night in the Caribbean. The ship Royal Fortune drifts quietly under a cloak of darkness. Suddenly, the lookout cries out, a merchant vessel spotted on the horizon. Captain Roberts stands on the quarterdeck, eyes sharp, voice calm but commanding. Men, the code is clear. We divide the loot fair and square. No man steals from his brother. We fight as one or not at all. The crew prepares. Muskets are cleaned, cutlasses are sharpened, yet there is no chaos here, no wild brawling or disarray, because the pirate code holds them together, like the rigging that keeps the ship afloat. Hours later, the merchant ship is overtaken. The spoils are gathered and brought before the crew. The quartermaster reads aloud the articles again, ensuring every man understands his share. The wounded are tended to. Those who lost limbs receive their gold. Disputes are settled by vote. This is piracy, raw, brutal, but governed by a strange order born of necessity. So, was there a pirate code? Yes, but not in the way popular culture imagines. It was not a universal, unbreakable law, but a set of agreed upon principles, flexible, pragmatic, and essential for survival. Pirates, despite their outlaw status, lived by rules that ensured fairness, discipline, and cooperation amid chaos. As we move forward, we'll dive deeper into the specific rules pirates lived by, how those rules were enforced, and what life was really like aboard these legendary ships. After uncovering that the pirate code was a real, flexible social contract, the next question is, what exactly were these rules? How did pirates govern themselves without kings or courts? What laws kept them from tearing each other apart? The answer lies in the articles, written or verbal agreements that outlined expectations, rights, and punishments. These articles varied between crews, but common threads ran through most, forming the backbone of pirate society, the backbone of pirate life. Articles of Agreement. Every pirate crew before setting sail typically met to discuss and agree upon a list of articles. These weren't imposed by the captain, but voted on by the crew, often democratically. It was the crew's contract to protect their interests, keep order, and set the rules of engagement. Let's examine some typical articles from well-documented pirate codes, such as those of Bartholomew Roberts, Edward Lowe, and John Phillips. 1. Division of loot, fair shares, and bonuses. One of the most crucial parts of the pirate code was how the spoils of raids were divided. The loot was shared almost equally among crew members, an unusual practice for the time. The captain and officers received extra shares as a reward for leadership and risk. For example, the captain might get 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, while ordinary crew members got 1 share each. Special rewards were set aside for those who showed exceptional bravery or performed key duties, like capturing a prize ship or navigating dangerous waters. This system fostered a sense of fairness and loyalty. Unlike naval crews or merchants, where captains often hoarded wealth, pirates ensured that every man had a stake in the voyage's success. 2. Discipline and conduct. Keeping the peace. Pirate ships were cramped and volatile places where tempers could flare easily. To maintain order, articles often included strict rules about conduct. No fighting or quarreling on board unless during battle. Weapons such as pistols or cutlasses had to be stowed safely below decks except in combat, preventing sudden fights. Theft from fellow crew members was punishable by death or marooning. Loyalty was paramount. Gambling and excessive drinking during voyages were often banned to avoid disputes and accidents. Stealing from the common stock of food or supplies was forbidden. These rules weren't just about control, they were survival mechanisms. A drunken brawl or theft could cost a crew its cohesion or even their lives. 3. Compensation for injury, the pirate's pension. Unlike most sailors of the time, pirates cared about their injured comrades. Many codes included detailed compensation plans for wounds sustained in battle. Losing a hand, arm, or leg merited a specific sum of gold. For example, a lost right arm might be worth 800 pieces of 8, a left arm, 500. Pirates injured in action who could no longer work were provided for, a kind of rudimentary disability insurance. This system encouraged bravery, knowing your risk would be acknowledged. It's remarkable that pirates, often branded as ruthless criminals, developed such social welfare within their crews. 4. Voting and democratic decision-making. Pirates practiced a surprising level of democracy. Captains were elected by the crew and could be deposed by a vote if the men lost confidence in their leadership. Important decisions, such as when to attack, where to sail, or how to spend the loot, were often decided by majority vote. Quartermasters, who handled discipline and loot distribution, were also elected and had powers to balance the captain's authority. This democratic structure was revolutionary in a world dominated by monarchies and rigid hierarchies. Pirate ships functioned as small republics on the high seas. 5. Rules about behavior and mutual respect. The pirate code also outlined expected behaviors to preserve harmony. No bringing women on board, as it often led to jealousy and fights. No desertion or abandoning ship during battle. Doing so was punishable by death. Respect for personal property and privacy was required. Sharing food and water fairly. Enforcing the rules. Punishments and consequence. Rules without consequences are meaningless, especially among pirates, where survival depended on trust and cooperation. Pirate codes were often brutally strict. Marooning, one of the most feared punishments, abandoning a pirate on a deserted island with minimal supplies. It was effectively a death sentence, but sometimes left a slim chance of survival. Death, for grave offenses like theft, mutiny, or desertion during battle, execution was common. Pirates showed no mercy for betrayal. Fines or forfeiture. Sometimes pirates would lose shares of loot or privileges for lesser offenses. Punishments were usually decided by vote or by the quartermaster, ensuring fairness and preventing abuse of power. Consider the pirate ship Fancy, captained by Henry Every, a man infamous for one of the most lucrative pirate raids ever recorded. On one voyage, a crew member was caught stealing from the common stash. According to Every's articles, theft was punishable by marooning. The man was given a chance to defend himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. The crew voted, and the verdict was unanimous. Under a blazing sun, the pirate was set ashore on a barren island with little more than a pistol and some water. The message was clear. The pirate code was law. Though harsh, this system kept the crew united and prevented chaos. Pirates lived by a harsh code, but one that gave them order amid the chaos of their lives. The pirate code, a unique social experiment, but as in an age when most people were subject to kings and aristocrats, pirates created a surprisingly egalitarian society aboard their ships. Their codes reflected a shared desire for fairness, justice, and survival. Through these articles, pirates exercised rights unheard of by common folk on land, voting, sharing wealth equally, and enforcing laws created by the community. This social experiment, born from necessity, gave pirates their strength, a fragile order in a sea of lawlessness. The sun dipped low behind a curtain of smoky clouds as the crew of the Royal Fortune gathered under the creaking mast. Captain Bartholomew Roberts stood tall, the sharp glint of his eyes cutting through the growing dusk. The salty breeze carried whispers of the sea, but what weighed heavier was the unspoken understanding. The code was their lifeline. "Listen well," Roberts began, voice steady and commanding. The shares you earn are your rightful dues. No man steals from another. Break this law and you will answer, not just to me, but to the whole crew. A murmur rippled through the men. They were a rough bunch, scarred faces, hardened hands, but here, beneath the tattered flag, fairness reigned supreme. The captain's words weren't mere threats, they were the essence of survival. Below deck, the ship hummed with tense anticipation. The quartermaster, a grizzled veteran named Thomas, meticulously counted the spoils from their last raid: glimmering silver coins, exotic fabrics, weapons sharpened to a deadly edge. He glanced up to see two pirates arguing over a piece of loot. One shoved the other roughly, fingers twitching toward a cutlass. Thomas's booming voice cut through the tension. Fight one more time without the crew's consent, and it's marooning for both of you. The men backed down immediately. The pirate code wasn't just words written on parchment, it was enforced with ruthless clarity. Life aboard a pirate ship was perilous, but it was also deeply communal. When Jacob, the ship's carpenter, lost his left hand in a skirmish, the crew didn't abandon him to his fate. Under the articles, he was granted a generous sum of gold, compensation for his injury, so he could start a new life ashore. Jacob sat by the fire one evening, the stump of his hand wrapped in coarse cloth. He lifted a cup of rum and smiled weakly. This code, it saved my life in more ways than one. Discipline was essential, but so was democracy. When a storm forced the Royal Fortune off course, the crew gathered in the ship's cramped mess. Voices clashed, tempers flared. The captain's word held sway only in battle, otherwise decisions were made by vote. "We head west, toward Tuga," a young pirate suggested. "Aye," another agreed. "But what about the Spanish fleet reported nearby?" One by one, each pirate voiced his opinion, and the majority chose their course. This system gave even the lowliest deckhand power, a stark contrast to the rigid naval hierarchies many had fled. But the pirate code was no gentle guide. It demanded loyalty, courage, and above all, order. When Samuel, a hot-headed gunner, was caught stealing from the food stores, the verdict was swift. Under the blazing sun of a remote isle, the crew made their decision, marooning the cruelest sentence. Samuel stood on the shore, a pistol in hand, watching his ship disappear over the horizon. No rescue awaited. The code was clear: betray the crew, and you pay the price. Even in the face of death, pirates respected their code. When an enemy vessel threatened their freedom, they fought as one. The captain led, but the crew had the final say. Votes decided battles to engage or avoid, ensuring no man was forced into certain death without consensus. This balance of freedom and order was a fragile dance. One misstep could mean mutiny or destruction. The pirate code wasn't just rules, it was a philosophy. Born in the unforgiving oceans, it forged a brotherhood, bound not by blood but by trust, fairness, and necessity. Pirates lived on the edge of chaos, but their code was the thin line that held their world together. Would you like me to keep weaving this narrative forward, blending more scenes and historical moments, or focus next on the psychological and social reasons behind the code? The Royal Fortune rocked gently beneath a sky smeared with the reds and purples of dusk. The salty breeze stirred the worn sails as a rough assembly of pirates gathered on deck. Bartholomew Roberts, tall and commanding, scanned his crew with a steely gaze. "Remember this," he said, voice cutting through the murmurs. "The code we live by isn't just ink on parchment. It's the blood and bone of our survival. Each man's share is sacred. Steal from your brothers, and you answer to us all." The pirates, scarred and weathered by countless battles, nodded grimly. Beneath the wild reputations lay a surprising order. Below deck, Thomas the quartermaster carefully counted piles of loot, silver coins gleaming in the lantern light. Two crewmen began arguing over a jeweled dagger. The tension could have sparked a fight, but Thomas's thunderous voice stopped them cold. One more fight without permission, and it's marooning for both. Tension eased. The pirate code was enforced with harsh fairness. Violators faced brutal punishment, but loyalty and respect bound the crew tighter than any chain. That loyalty showed when Jacob, the ship's carpenter, lost his left hand during a raid. The code ensured he was compensated generously, a rare kind of pension in a brutal world. One night by the fire, Jacob raised his rum cup and smiled faintly. This code saved me more than once. Decisions on the royal fortune were rarely made by the captain alone. When a storm veered them off course, the crew crowded in the cramped mess to debate their next move. Voices clashed, but votes decided should they sail west to Tortuga or avoid the rumored Spanish fleet. Every voice counted. Power flowed from the bottom up, a radical democracy amid piracy's lawlessness. But the code's justice was swift and cruel. Samuel, a gunner caught stealing food, was marooned on a barren island under the blistering sun with only a pistol and scant water. As his ship vanished on the horizon, the price of betrayal was clear. Survival depended on absolute trust. When battle threatened, the captain led, but the crew's consent was paramount. No man was forced into certain death without a vote. Freedom and discipline danced in a delicate balance. One wrong move could mean mutiny or massacre. This was no mere list of rules, but a philosophy etched into every scar and shouted order. Pirates, outlaws on the edge of chaos, bound themselves by the code to survive, to share, to fight as brothers. Theirs was a society carved from necessity, a fragile order within the wild sea. The royal fortune rocked gently beneath a sky smeared with the reds and purples of dusk. The salty breeze stirred the worn sails as a rough assembly of pirates gathered on deck. Bartholomew Roberts, tall and commanding, scanned his crew with a steely gaze. "Remember this," he said, voice cutting through the murmurs. "The code we live by isn't just ink on parchment. It's the blood and bone of our survival. Each man's share is sacred. Steal from your brothers, and you answer to us all." The pirates, scarred and weathered by countless battles, nodded grimly. Beneath the wild reputations lay a surprising order. Below deck, Thomas the quartermaster carefully counted piles of loot, silver coins gleaming in the lantern light. Two crewmen began arguing over a jeweled dagger. The tension could have sparked a fight, but Thomas's thunderous voice stopped them cold. One more fight without permission, and it's marooning for both. Tension eased. The pirate code was enforced with harsh fairness. Violators faced brutal punishment, but loyalty and respect bound the crew tighter than any chain. That loyalty showed when Jacob, the ship's carpenter, lost his left hand during a raid. The code ensured he was compensated generously, a rare kind of pension in a brutal world. One night by the fire, Jacob raised his rum cup and smiled faintly. "This code saved me more than once." Decisions on the royal fortune were rarely made by the captain alone. When a storm veered them off course, the crew crowded in the cramped mess to debate their next move. Voices clashed, but votes decided. Should they sail west to Tortuga or avoid the rumored Spanish fleet? Every voice counted. Power flowed from the bottom up, a radical democracy amid piracy's lawlessness. But the code's justice was swift and cruel. Samuel, a gunner caught stealing food, was marooned on a barren island under the blistering sun with only a pistol and scant water. As his ship vanished on the horizon, the price of betrayal was clear. Survival depended on absolute trust. When battle threatened, the captain led, but the crew's consent was paramount. No man was forced into certain death without a vote. Freedom and discipline danced in a delicate balance. One wrong move could mean mutiny or massacre. This was no mere list of rules, but a philosophy etched into every scar and shouted order. Pirates, Outlaws on the edge of chaos bound themselves by the code to survive, to share, to fight as brothers. Theirs was a society carved from necessity, a fragile order within the wild sea. But why did pirates, outlaws by definition, choose to live by such strict rules? What drove men who rejected kings and laws to create their own laws, sometimes harsher than those they escaped? The answer lies deep in the precarious world they inhabited. The sea was a place of constant peril. Ships could be lost to storms in an instant. Hunger gnawed at bellies. Disease spread like wildfire. In this environment, trust was everything. A captain who stole from his crew, or a pirate who hid loot, would not only risk his own life, but threaten the survival of all. The pirate code was their insurance policy against chaos. It was a fragile bond forged through blood, sweat, and desperation, a social contract that balanced the wild freedom of piracy with the order needed to keep a ship afloat and a crew alive. At the heart of it was equality, at least among the men aboard ship. Unlike the strict hierarchies of navies or merchant vessels, where officers often lived in luxury while common sailors starved, pirates split their wealth more evenly. This fairness was revolutionary for its time and bred fierce loyalty. Every pirate, no matter how lowly, had a voice. The captain could be voted out if the crew lost faith. The quartermaster, often as powerful as the captain, served as the crew's advocate and disciplinarian. Such democracy was rare in the 18th century. This system worked because pirates had no king or navy to protect them. Their strength was in their unity and shared purpose. The code kept that unity intact. As the Royal Fortune sailed into another moonlit night, the crew prepared for what lay ahead. New battles, new fortunes, new dangers. Their lives were brutal and short, but bound by the code, they were more than mere criminals. They were a brotherhood, shaped by the sea and their shared laws. And so the legend of the pirate code lives on, not just as myth or Hollywood fantasy, but as the real heartbeat of piracy's golden age, a delicate balance of freedom and order on the wild, unforgiving sea. The Royal Fortune slipped silently through the glassy waters under a vault of stars, each pirate lost in thought beneath the billowing sails. For many, the sea was more than just a battlefield or a hunt for treasure. It was home. But this home was fragile, held together by threads woven from trust, fairness, and an unyielding code. Without it, they were doomed to chaos and destruction. Captain Roberts paced the quarterdeck, the weight of command pressing down on his broad shoulders. His eyes caught the flickering lantern light as the crew prepared their weapons, muskets polished, cutlasses sharpened, ready for the next encounter. Yet despite the tension, a strange calm settled over them. They were bound by something greater than fear or greed, their code. "You all know what's at stake," Roberts said, voice low but firm. "Every man here deserves his share. The code protects us from ourselves. Without it, we're nothing but rats fighting over scraps." He paused, letting the words sink in. Around him, nods and murmurs confirmed the truth. Pirates lived at the edge of lawlessness, but the pirate code was their anchor in the storm. Below decks, Thomas the quartermaster went over the loot from their latest prize, a merchant ship heavy with spices, gold, and fine cloth. He carefully divided coins into piles, calling out shares as the crew gathered around, eyes gleaming with anticipation. One pirate grumbled, his hand hovering over a golden chain. "That's mine," he hissed. Thomas fixed him with a cold stare. "The code says no man takes more than his share. Steal from your brothers, and you pay the price." The pirate backed down, knowing full well the consequences. On pirate ships, theft wasn't a petty crime, it was treason. Punishment was swift and merciless. Marooning, hanging, or worse awaited those who broke the sacred trust. Life at sea was merciless, injuries were common, and pirates knew the price of bravery could be an arm, a leg, or worse. When Jacob, the ship's skilled carpenter, lost his left hand in a bloody skirmish, it was the code that spared him from despair. Gathered by the firelight, Jacob accepted his compensation, enough gold to live comfortably ashore. "They didn't abandon me," he said quietly, eyes wet with gratitude. "In a world so cruel, that means everything." This sense of mutual care was unheard of in the harsh naval world, where injured sailors were often left to rot. Pirates, outlaws though they were, created their own form of justice and support, a testament to their code's power. Decision-making aboard the Royal Fortune was a living example of pirate democracy. When a fierce storm tossed the ship far off course, the crew assembled in the cramped mess to decide their next destination. Voices clashed like thunder. Some wanted to push toward Tortuga, a haven of freedom and revelry. Others feared the Spanish fleet rumored to be nearby. Captain Roberts raised his hand, but it wasn't his word alone that settled the matter. One by one, the pirates voiced their opinions, arguments flying like cannon fire. Finally, a vote was called. The majority chose westward. This wasn't just about navigation, it was about survival and trust. Every man's voice counted, an extraordinary system that made pirates unique in their era, a fragile republic afloat on a sea of danger. But the pirate code demanded more than fairness. It demanded absolute loyalty. Samuel, a reckless gunner, learned this the hard way. Caught stealing rations during a desperate voyage, Samuel's fate was sealed. The crew convened swiftly. Punishment was clear. Marooning on a remote, barren island, no man betrayed his brothers and lived. As Samuel stood on the shore, pistol in hand, watching the Royal Fortune fade into the horizon, the weight of isolation crashed down on him. The code was unforgiving but necessary. When battle loomed, the code shone brightest. Pirates fought not as chaotic bands, but as a united force, bound by trust and law. The captain commanded the attack, but no one was forced into certain death. Decisions to fight or flee were made collectively. This balance of freedom and discipline was perilous. One false step could ignite mutiny or doom, yet it worked. For a time, pirates, outlaws on the edge of society, were not mere criminals, but architects of a radical social experiment. Their code challenged the rigid hierarchies and injustices of the empires they defied. Equality in wealth, democracy in leadership, compensation for injury, these were revolutionary ideas cast into the turbulent waters of the high seas. As the Royal Fortune sailed deeper into the night, the stars overhead whispered ancient secrets of freedom and law. The pirates knew their lives were short and brutal, but bound by the code, they found order in chaos, brotherhood in rebellion, and meaning in the endless horizon. Their story wasn't just of plunder and violence, it was of a fragile society born from necessity, forever etched in the legend of the pirate code. The salty night air wrapped around the Royal Fortune like a shroud as the crew gathered silently, the weight of unspoken worries pressing upon their shoulders. This was the reality beneath the romanticized tales, the cold truth of pirate life, constant danger, brutal choices, and the precarious balance of trust maintained by their code. It wasn't just a list of rules on parchment, it was a living contract, tested and hardened by fire. Every man on board understood that the fragile order they clung to was the difference between brotherhood and bloodbath. In the dim glow of lanterns, stories whispered among the crew painted the picture of their harsh but just world. Tales of pirate captains who upheld the code to keep their men alive, of quartermasters wielding the power to punish, but also to protect, of sailors who'd rather die than break their solemn oaths. And then there were the moments when that fragile trust shattered, when greed tempted even the most loyal, when fear cracked the strongest bonds, and when the code was bent or broken in the name of survival. The consequences were swift and often brutal. A stolen coin could mean exile on a deserted isle. Mutiny could ignite a massacre. The code was not mercy, it was necessity. But beyond survival, the pirate code revealed a startling truth. Pirates sought something more than gold and freedom. They craved fairness in a world stacked against them. In an era of kings and tyrants, their ships were rare havens of democracy, equality, and shared purpose. Every vote counted. Every injury was honored. Every man had a voice, a stake, a right to live by the rules he helped create. The code was a paradox, born from lawlessness, yet birthing order, from rebellion, yet demanding discipline. It was the silent compass guiding those who chose to live outside the world's laws, yet still craved justice and brotherhood. As the royal fortune sailed on into the unknown, the code remained unbroken, the invisible tether binding men and myths alike. For every pirate who raised the black flag, there was the code beneath, fierce, unyielding, and real. This was the truth behind the legend. Pirates did follow rules, not the rules of kings or courts, but rules of their own making, harsh, fair, and necessary. And in that, the pirate code was the greatest treasure of all. Shall I continue now with real-life examples of famous pirate codes like those of Henry Morgan, Blackbeard, and others, or explore how Hollywood twisted these stories into myths? The salty night air wrapped around the royal fortune like a shroud as the crew gathered silently, the weight of unspoken worries pressing upon their shoulders. This was the reality beneath the romanticized tales, the cold truth of pirate life, constant danger, brutal choices, and the precarious balance of trust maintained by their code. It wasn't just a list of rules on parchment, it was a living contract, tested and hardened by fire. Every man on board understood that the fragile order they clung to was the difference between brotherhood and bloodbath. In the dim glow of lanterns, stories whispered among the crew painted the picture of their harsh but just world, tales of pirate captains who upheld the code to keep their men alive, of quartermasters wielding the power to punish but also to protect, of sailors who'd rather die than break their solemn oaths. And then there were the moments when that fragile trust shattered, when greed tempted even the most loyal, when fear cracked the strongest bonds, and when the code was bent or broken in the name of survival. The consequences were swift and often brutal. A stolen coin could mean exile on a deserted isle. Mutiny could ignite a massacre. The code was not mercy, it was necessity. But beyond survival, the pirate code revealed a startling truth. Pirates sought something more than gold and freedom. They craved fairness in a world stacked against them. In an era of kings and tyrants, their ships were rare havens of democracy, equality, and shared purpose. Every vote counted. Every injury was honored. Every man had a voice, a stake, a right to live by the rules he helped create. The code was a paradox, born from lawlessness, yet birthing order, from rebellion, yet demanding discipline. It was the silent compass guiding those who chose to live outside the world's laws, yet still craved justice and brotherhood. As the royal fortune sailed on into the unknown, the code remained unbroken, the invisible tether binding men and myths alike. For every pirate who raised the black flag, there was the code beneath, fierce, unyielding, and real. This was the truth behind the legend. Pirates did follow rules, not the rules of kings or courts, but rules of their own making, harsh, fair, and necessary. And in that, the pirate code was the greatest treasure of all. But to truly understand the pirate code, we must dive into the lives of the men who forged it, the infamous captains whose names still send shivers down spines centuries later. Take Henry Morgan, for instance. Known as much for his cunning as his cruelty, Morgan's crew operated under strict articles that emphasized discipline and fair division of spoils. Unlike the common image of piratical chaos, Morgan insisted on order, knowing his men's loyalty depended on justice. His code demanded that no man strike another aboard ship, and that quarrels be settled by the quartermaster, the crew's trusted arbiter. When Morgan's men raided Spanish settlements, they did so not as a rabble, but as a disciplined force, bound by shared rules. Then there was Blackbeard, Edward Teach, whose fearsome reputation was bolstered not only by his towering figure and blazing matchlock, but by his own interpretation of the pirate code. His crew swore to keep quiet about their raids, to share booty fairly, and to fight to the death when necessary. Blackbeard's code was less detailed in surviving documents, but tales suggest a brutal enforcement of loyalty and swift punishment for betrayal. His reign, though short, exemplified how the code was as much about survival as it was about power. Yet, it wasn't just the captains who shaped these laws. Quartermasters wielded immense influence, ensuring fairness in distribution and discipline. They could challenge a captain's orders if they threatened the crew's interests, a revolutionary check on power in an era of absolute monarchs. Pirates lived in a balance of power, unlike any other, where democracy existed alongside brutality and camaraderie stood beside deadly consequence. Life under the pirate code was harsh but just. The articles covered everything from the division of plunder to compensation for injuries, from prohibiting gambling to forbidding bringing women aboard to avoid jealousy-fueled fights. Pirates knew that without such rules, their fragile society would collapse into anarchy and ruin, and so they lived by the code, obeying it as strictly as any king's law. As the years passed, the legend of the pirate code grew, shaped by tales and retellings. Hollywood and literature painted it as a romantic, noble set of rules, binding swashbuckling heroes. In truth, the code was far grimmer, a necessary pact for survival among men who lived by the sword and could die at any moment. Yet, despite its harshness, the code gave pirates something rare, a sense of justice and equality. They carved out a space of freedom in a world ruled by oppression. Their code was their rebellion, their contract, their fragile hope on the endless, unforgiving sea. And so, when you hear the stories of pirates, the black flags, the buried treasure, the merciless raids, remember the code. Remember that even in lawlessness, men sought order. The pirate code was not just a myth, but a vital truth of their existence. It was the unseen map guiding them through chaos, the greatest treasure they ever possessed. The Royal Fortune sailed under a sky smeared with stars, the ocean's endless expanse reflecting their flickering lights like scattered diamonds. Below the surface of legend and lore lay the gritty truth of pirate life, one of hardship, camaraderie, and an unbreakable code that bound these men together more tightly than blood. The pirate code was not just a set of rules, it was their lifeline, the fragile thread between survival and chaos. The origins of this code were born out of necessity. Pirates were outlaws, yes, but they were also pragmatic men who understood that their survival depended on trust and fairness. The vast sea offered no courts, no kings to enforce law. Only the crew itself could maintain order, and for that they created their own laws. Among these laws, the division of loot stood paramount. Unlike the navies and merchant fleets they preyed upon, where captains took most of the riches and sailors barely scraped by. Pirate crews agreed to share spoils equitably. The captain might receive 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, but every ordinary sailor got an equal portion. This fairness forged fierce loyalty and minimized internal strife. It was revolutionary, a small democracy afloat on an ocean of tyranny. The articles went beyond money. They dictated behavior, discipline, and mutual respect. No man could draw his sword below decks unless in battle. No stealing from one's comrades. Gambling and excessive drinking were banned on long voyages to prevent fights. Injuries were compensated. Losing a hand or leg earned a pirate a generous gold sum. Such provisions ensured a basic welfare system in a brutal world. Pirates practiced democracy in an era dominated by kings. Captains were elected by the crew and could be voted out if they failed their duties. The quartermaster, often as powerful as the captain, managed discipline and loot distribution, acting as the crew's representative. Decisions from battle plans to destinations were made collectively, each voice heard. It was a radical experiment in equality and governance. Yet the code demanded loyalty and harsh justice. Betrayal meant swift punishment, marooning on deserted islands or execution. Pirates could not afford weakness or treachery. The code was enforced with iron resolve because their very lives depended on it. Famous pirates embodied these principles with their own twists. Bartholomew Roberts, one of history's most successful pirates, was famed for his detailed articles that included cleanliness rules and prohibitions on gambling and drunkenness. Henry Morgan's crew upheld discipline and fair shares, even in the chaos of Caribbean raids. Blackbeard's crew enforced loyalty with fearsome rigor, though tales blur fact and legend. The pirate code was thus a paradox, born of rebellion and lawlessness, but enforcing order and fairness. It created a brotherhood forged in hardship and danger, a society carved from the wilderness of the seas. The myth of pirates as lawless savages hides this deeper truth. Beneath the black flags and violent raids was a fragile but real order. The pirate code was their treasure, their social contract, their map through the storm. As the Royal Fortune vanished into the foggy horizon, its crew carried more than swords and gold. They carried a legacy that challenges our notions of freedom and justice, reminding us that even in the wildest rebellion, men crave order, fairness, and a code to live and die by. The Royal Fortune creaked and groaned as it cut through the endless waves, the moonlight casting silver shadows on the weathered faces of the crew. Each man carried stories etched into their bones, stories of battles fought not just against enemies on distant shores, but also against the chaos within their own ranks. It was the pirate code that kept these stories from turning into nightmares of mutiny and despair across the world's oceans. From the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, pirate crews forged their own societies, bound by similar laws though shaped by different captains. The famous pirate Roberts, for example, wrote a code that forbade drunkenness and fighting aboard ship, insisted on cleanliness, and demanded absolute respect for the distribution of loot. Every pirate signed his name to the articles, an oath that carried the weight of death for betrayal. Far from the glamorous depictions in stories and film, pirate life was brutally unforgiving. Food was scarce, disease common, and the constant threat of capture loomed like a dark cloud. Yet the code provided a strange comfort, an agreement that no matter what, every man would get his fair share, every injury would be compensated, and every voice would be heard. Take the story of Captain John Phillips, whose code included provisions that punished gambling with loss of loot shares and gave each pirate the right to voice complaints. His quartermaster was given authority to settle disputes, balancing the captain's power. This system of checks and balances was unique to piracy and ensured a surprising level of fairness and discipline. Even Blackbeard, whose terrifying reputation was cemented by tales of violence and ruthlessness, upheld a strict code among his crew. Loyalty was everything, and betrayal was met with death or marooning. His men swore secrecy, shared plunder equally, and stood united in battle. Behind the fearsome image was a social contract, as binding as any king's decree. The pirate code's influence extended beyond the seas. It inspired whispers of democracy and equality at a time when such ideas were dangerous and rare. Pirates lived in a paradox, embracing freedom while enforcing discipline, rejecting kings but obeying their own laws, and seeking both fortune and justice. As the royal fortune sailed deeper into the unknown, the sea's endless horizon symbolized both opportunity and peril. For pirates, their code was the compass by which they navigated not only treacherous waters, but the complexities of human nature itself. In the end, the pirate code was more than rules. It was a radical experiment in society, a fragile brotherhood forged from desperation, courage, and a hunger for fairness. It is the true heart of piracy, beating beneath the legends, reminding us that even in rebellion, order finds a way. The Royal Fortune drifted further into the moonlit abyss, its sails whispering secrets to the night sky. Beneath the deck, the crew settled into uneasy rest, each man carrying the weight of the day's spoils and the knowledge that tomorrow might bring fire and steel. Yet amid the uncertainty, the pirate code remained a beacon, an unspoken vow that bound them all. It was this code that gave pirates their surprising strength, for the sea was no place for the reckless or the selfish. On a ship where every man's life depended on the other, fairness wasn't just moral, it was survival. The captain's orders held sway in battle, but outside of it, power was shared. The quartermaster was a man elected by the crew, empowered to mediate disputes and ensure that the captain did not overreach. This democratic system was rare in a world ruled by kings and monarchs. The code covered even the smallest details, no bringing women aboard to avoid jealousy and bloodshed, no gambling which could spark discord, and strict rules about weapons below deck to prevent sudden violence. The punishments were harsh but clear. Theft could mean marooning, disobedience death. It was a world where mercy was scarce, but justice was swift. The articles often included a form of insurance. Wounded pirates received compensation, a rare form of social welfare in the 18th century. Losing a limb or an eye was tragic, but it did not mean abandonment. This care fostered fierce loyalty and courage. No man fought harder, knowing that if he fell, his crew would honor him. Famous pirate crews like those of Bartholomew Roberts, Henry Morgan, and John Phillips lived these codes daily. Their ships were microcosms of society, rough, brutal, but governed by rules crafted to maintain order amid chaos. When disagreements arose, they were settled not by the captain's whim, but by the collective will of the crew. Yet, despite the strictness, pirates enjoyed freedoms unheard of in their time. They could elect their leaders, share equally in riches, and hold power to account. This paradox, a lawless society ruled by laws, made piracy unique. The mythos built by Hollywood and storytellers often misses this nuance, painting pirates as reckless villains or romantic heroes. The truth is far more complex and fascinating. Pirates were survivors who forged their own justice system to endure a hostile world. As dawn approached and the royal fortune slipped into the mist, the crew prepared once more for the uncertain life ahead. Their code was more than words. It was their shield, their sword, their bond. It was the true heart of piracy, and so the legend endures, not just in tales of treasure and terror, but in the enduring truth that even in rebellion, men crave order, fairness, and a code to live and die by. As the first pale streaks of dawn stretched across the horizon, the royal fortune pressed onward, its timbers groaning beneath the weight of both the sea and the lives it carried. The pirates aboard, hardened men who had cast off the chains of empire and monarchy, knew full well that the life they had chosen was one of peril without end. Yet in the heart of this danger, in the middle of a world that called them outlaws, they had forged something remarkable, a society of their own making, a republic at sea, governed by a code not written in royal halls, but carved from necessity and survival. It is easy to imagine pirates as chaotic forces of destruction, as mindless savages chasing gold and glory, but the truth, always more fascinating than legend, is that pirate crews were among the most organized and self-governing communities of their time. In an age when monarchs ruled by divine right and common men had no voice, pirates dared to craft their own laws, to vote on their leadership, and to hold their captains accountable. They were, in many ways, accidental revolutionaries, men who, through sheer desperation and circumstance, stumbled upon radical ideas of fairness and equality that the world on land would not taste for another 100 years. The Pirate Code, or Articles as they were often called, was not a mere formality. It was a living document, often negotiated and agreed upon before a voyage began. Every man had a say in its creation, and every man swore to uphold it. If you broke it, you did not simply face a slap on the wrist, you faced exile, punishment, or death. And for pirates, men who lived and died by the loyalty of the crew, nothing was more terrifying than betrayal. This code touched every part of their lives. It dictated how loot was shared, not hoarded by officers but divided, so that every hand that risked death received a portion. It specified rules of conduct: no fighting aboard ship unless sanctioned, no theft among brethren, no desertion in the heat of battle. It outlined systems of compensation for injury, with precise sums awarded for the loss of a limb or an eye, amounts that could mean the difference between poverty and dignity for a maimed sailor. And perhaps most crucially, it enshrined the right to vote on critical decisions: where to sail, whom to fight, when to run. Imagine a group of men, former slaves, escaped sailors, runaway soldiers, gathered in the belly of a creaking ship, passing around a battered lantern as they voted on whether to chase a distant ship or to seek refuge on some hidden shore. Each voice counted. Each man knew his fate lay in the hands of his equals, not in the whims of an untouchable aristocrat. In the age of absolute kings, this was nothing short of revolutionary. But this fragile democracy was built on the edge of a knife. The code was strict because it had to be. Without discipline, a ship could fall into mutiny, or worse, lose the cohesion necessary to survive storms, battles, or betrayals. Marooning, leaving a man stranded alone on an island, was one of the most feared punishments. It was not simply death, it was slow, torturous isolation, a fate worse than the gallows. Even the great Blackbeard, a man whose name still echoes across the centuries, is remembered not just for his fearsome image, but for the discipline he maintained aboard his ship. His legend tells of theatrical violence, yes, but also of an iron rule that kept his crew bound together long enough to terrorize the Atlantic. His articles, though fewer in number than some of his contemporaries, reflected the same basic principles: equality in loot, loyalty above all, and obedience in battle. Other captains, like the flamboyant Calico Jack Rackham or the infamous Charles Vane, met their ends not because of external foes, but because they lost the trust of their crews. In piracy, leadership was conditional, earned, not inherited. A captain who led his men to ruin could be voted out or abandoned without ceremony. The code made no allowances for incompetence. These systems were not utopian. Life aboard a pirate ship was brutally hard. Food was scarce, disease was rampant, and violence was an ever-present shadow. Yet within this hardship, pirates carved out a rare form of justice, a fairness that the lands they left behind refused to offer. On the high seas, a man could rise not through noble birth, but through courage, skill, and the consent of his peers. The very existence of the pirate code challenges the myths spun by centuries of literature and cinema. Pirates were not anarchists. They were not, by and large, madmen or mindless marauders. They were men who understood that true freedom could only exist with boundaries, that to survive together in the wild, untamed reaches of the world, they needed rules, they needed order, they needed each other. As the Royal Fortune sailed toward the rising sun, its sails billowed with the breath of 1,000 forgotten voices, sailors who lived and died under the code. Some would fall to British nooses, others to cannon fire or fever, but for a time they tasted a freedom most men only dreamed of. Not the lawless freedom of chaos, but the freedom of choice, of fairness, of brotherhood. And though the ships are long gone, and the names of many pirates have been swallowed by the deep, The pirate code endures. It lives in the legends we tell, in the echoes of rebellion, in every story of men who refuse to be ruled by tyranny. It is the heartbeat of piracy, not the gold, not the gunpowder, but the simple idea that even the wildest outlaws can choose to live by a code, and that, in the end, may be the greatest treasure they ever claimed. The Royal Fortune pressed through the steel-gray waters, her black flag snapping sharply in the rising wind, as if the ship itself bore witness to the ghosts of all who had sailed before under the banner of piracy. Each creaking timber, each frayed rope held echoes of countless men who had bound themselves not just to their ship or their captain, but to a code, a fragile but powerful agreement that set them apart from both the kings they defied and the savagery they risked becoming. To truly understand the weight of this code, one must step beyond the wooden decks and salt-stained sails and into the hearts of the men themselves. These were not monsters born, but men made, many driven to piracy by brutal conditions in the merchant navies or the unforgiving hierarchies of empire. A sailor on a British or Spanish vessel could expect endless toil, meager rations, violent punishment, and almost no share in the wealth he helped transport. Wages were pitiful, loyalty was meaningless, and injury often meant death and squalor. For these men, piracy was not just rebellion, it was escape. And in that escape, the pirate code became their lifeline. The articles varied from ship to ship, but always shared common threads. Equal division of plunder ensured that every man, from the lowliest deckhand to the fiercest gunner, shared in the success of their endeavors. Compensation for injury, a lost leg, a blinded eye, offered dignity where the navies of kings would offer only abandonment. Decorum was enforced not by birthright, but by collective agreement. No fighting aboard ship without proper cause, no theft among crew, no desertion. Even disputes were handled with a rough civility, often settled ashore or by the quartermaster, whose authority balanced that of the captain. The quartermaster's role cannot be overstated. While Hollywood often glorifies the pirate captain as an untouchable figure, the truth was far more democratic. The captain ruled in battle, yes, but in times of peace, the quartermaster often held greater sway. He was the guardian of the articles, the voice of the men, the enforcer of justice. It was the quartermaster who ensured that no man, captain included, took more than his fair share. One striking example of this balance can be found in the articles of Captain Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps the most successful pirate of the so-called Golden Age. Roberts' code was meticulous. He forbade gambling on board. Lights had to be extinguished by 8 o'clock. Musicians were required to play on Sundays, and anyone caught stealing from the crew faced a swift and terrible punishment. Under Roberts, piracy was not lawless. It was structured, disciplined, and eerily efficient. His success, more than 400 ships taken, owed much to the stability offered by his code. Yet not all pirates followed such tight discipline. Charles Vane, known for his cruelty and recklessness, ultimately lost his command because he broke faith with his men. His refusal to share loot fairly and his reckless attacks on superior foes led his crew to vote him out, a fate worse than death for a pirate captain. It was a potent reminder the code was not mere suggestion, it was survival. A captain who lost the confidence of his crew was no captain at all. Another famed example is Captain John Phillips, whose articles were discovered after his capture. They included such gems as the right of every man to a voice in major decisions, the obligation to keep weapons clean and ready, and the rule that any man found guilty of cowardice in battle would be shot. Philip's code is striking for its clarity and for the simple humanity it reflects an understanding that in the perilous theater of the sea, discipline and fairness were paramount. It wasn't just the Atlantic or the Caribbean where these codes held sway. Pirates of the Indian Ocean, such as those who sailed with the notorious Henry Every, adopted similar systems. Every's capture of the Mughal treasure ship Ganji Sawai in 1695 made him the richest pirate in history, but it also showcased the brutal efficiency of pirate democracy. His men shared equally in the loot, and the success of the raid underscored the power of cooperation under shared rules. But what of the punishment? What of the marooned, the whipped, the hanged? The code's justice was often swift and without mercy because the alternative, chaos, was worse. Marooning, in particular, was feared above all. To be left alone in an island with nothing but a pistol and one shot, this was not only death but exile from the only society a pirate had, his crew. In this way, the code functioned not just as law, but as the very definition of belonging. And while death was a constant companion on the high seas, pirates faced it with a certain grim acceptance. The articles they lived by offered not only structure but dignity, an assurance that they would not be cheated by the same systems of class and power they had fled. Even when captured, many pirates died proudly, defiantly, sometimes quoting their articles as they faced the gallows. The mythology that grew in the centuries that followed, books, plays, and later films, often stripped away this reality in favor of spectacle. Pirates became symbols of freedom, of wild abandon, of romantic adventure. The true complexity of their lives, the fragile democracies they built, the codes they enforced, the grim necessity of their punishments was replaced by caricatures of drunken rogues and buried gold. Yet, if you listen carefully, beneath the roar of cannon fire and the clash of cutlasses, the heartbeat of the pirate code still echoes. It echoes in the idea that leadership must be earned, not inherited. It whispers in the belief that justice must be shared, that no man should claim wealth without risk or power without consent. It is an ancient voice, carried on salt winds and woven into the fabric of every legend that followed. The Royal Fortune sailed on, its black flag still high, its crew bound not by chains but by choice. And as long as ships cross oceans and men dream of freedom, the story of the pirate code will endure, not as myth, but as testament to the strange and ragged humanity at the heart of the pirate life. The wind howled through the rigging of the Royal Fortune as dawn gave way to the harsh glare of day. Salt spray lashed the weathered faces of the crew but their hands moved with practiced precision, trimming sails, checking lines, sharpening blades, each man a cog in the living, breathing machine that was their ship. Yet above all else, what kept the royal fortune alive was not timber or canvas or steel, but the invisible thread of trust, the code that bound these men together. The pirate code was more than parchment, more than ink. It was an unwritten oath that lived in the marrow of every sailor who had ever cast off the chains of kings and sought freedom beneath the black flag. But as with all fragile things, the code's power lay in its mutual recognition. It was not enforced by divine right or military command, but by collective will. When that will fractured, when greed, fear, or ambition disrupted the balance, the results could be catastrophic. History is filled with such moments: the breaking of the code, the descent into mutiny, and the brutal consequences that followed. One of the most infamous examples is the story of Captain William Kidd, a man who walked the perilous line between pirate and privateer. Originally commissioned by the English crown to hunt down pirates, Kidd soon found himself seduced by the very treasures he was meant to seize. His men, restless and hungry for plunder, pushed him toward piracy. But when tensions over loot distribution arose, when the unspoken social contract between captain and crew began to fray, Kidd's authority collapsed. Accused of murder and piracy, he was ultimately captured, brought back to London, and hanged. Kidd's downfall is not merely the tale of a man gone rogue. It is a parable of what happens when the delicate balance of trust shatters. Mutinies were the ultimate expression of pirate democracy gone awry. When a captain failed his crew, whether through poor leadership, unequal shares, or cowardice, he could be deposed in an instant. Charles Vane learned this the hard way. Vane's refusal to engage a potentially lucrative target, a large French warship, so enraged his men that they removed him from command mid-voyage. Vane, once a feared name, was set adrift, abandoned by the very men who had sworn to follow him. His story ends with capture and death by hanging, but the lesson remains in the pirate world. Authority was conditional. No crown could save you once the code turned against you. Not all mutinies led to tragedy, however. The career of the infamous Edward Lowe began as a mutiny. Originally a deckhand, Lowe and his fellow conspirators seized control of their ship and embarked on one of the bloodiest campaigns of the age. Lowe's own code, far darker and more violent than many of his contemporaries, still maintained the essentials: equal division of loot, shared decision-making, and the brutal enforcement of discipline. Even the most bloodthirsty captains knew that without the framework of fairness, the center could not hold. The decline of the pirate code came not from within, but from without. By the early 18th century, the world's empires, Britain, Spain, France, had begun to take piracy seriously. New naval patrols, anti-piracy laws, and brutal public executions made the once thriving havens of Nassau, Port Royal, and Madagascar dangerous for pirates. Many of the old codes, once proudly nailed to masts or carried in oilcloth pouches, began to fade as desperation replaced principle. Pirates who once lived by the articles found themselves forced into more savage survival. The balance between freedom and fairness crumbled as the sea itself turned hostile. One by one, the legendary captains fell. Blackbeard's head swung from the bowsprit of a British ship. Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Red, names that once inspired dread, were captured, tried, and in most cases, executed. The dream of the pirate republic, of ships where every man held an equal voice, flickered and died, and yet the legend lived on. It lived in the whispered stories of shipwrecks and buried treasure, in the secret coves and nameless graves along the Caribbean's shattered coasts, in the idea that somewhere, somehow, there could exist a place beyond kings and crowns, a place where men lived by their own rules. Even as the golden age of piracy drew to a close, the mythos of the pirate code proved too powerful to die. The very empires that sought to destroy pirates found themselves haunted by their legacy. Philosophers of the Enlightenment, revolutionaries of later centuries, and countless writers and dreamers would look back on the pirates' fragile experiments in freedom as early sparks of democratic ideals. Today, the image of the pirate endures, not just as lawless villains, but as symbols of resistance, freedom, and the eternal human longing to write one's own destiny. The pirate code, stripped of its blood and terror, survives in our collective imagination as the law of the rebel, the charter of the free. But the truth, darker and more complex, lies buried beneath the waves. For every pirate who dreamed of freedom, there were countless others who drowned in greed, who died alone on forgotten shores, who faced the noose with eyes wide in fear. The code offered no guarantees, only a chance. As the royal fortune drifted into the mist, the ghostly outlines of its crew, real and imagined, faded into the deep. The code lived in them still, whispered in the crash of waves, etched into the bones of shipwrecks, and in the restless hearts of those who, even today, feel the pull of the sea and the call of freedom. And so the story continues. Beneath the fading silhouette of the royal fortune, as the horizon bled gold and scarlet into the restless sea, the ghosts of the pirate code sailed on, unseen perhaps, but not forgotten. For though the golden age of piracy died beneath the gallows and cannon fire of empires, the ideas born upon those ships would seep like salt into the bones of history itself. The pirate code, in its rawest form, was not just a set of rules, it was a radical rejection of the old world. In the rigid societies of the 17th and 18th centuries, a man's fate was often sealed at birth. The son of a peasant remained a peasant. The poor had no voice. The law belonged to the rich. But aboard a pirate ship, the game changed. Leadership was elected, decisions were shared, and justice, however rough, was accessible to all. For a time, these floating republics offered something rare, a voice to the voiceless. The spark of egalitarianism, forged in blood and salt, would not die with the last noosed pirate. It would re-emerge, quietly, indirectly, in revolutions yet to come. Historians have long debated how much of this influence was deliberate and how much accidental. The pirate code did not inspire the American Revolution or the French Revolution in any organized way, but the spirit, the idea that authority must be earned, that leadership can be questioned, and that all men deserve a share in the fruits of their labor, echoes unmistakably through the democratic ideals that reshaped the modern world. Even in the earliest American colonies, whispers of pirate havens like Nassau and Tortuga filtered through taverns and docksides. These places, though viewed as dens of vice by the ruling powers, were also places where freed slaves, escaped indentured servants, and deserters could live beyond the thumb of monarchs and masters. The pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, became more than a symbol of terror. It became a banner of resistance, a black defiance against the world's empires. But the transformation of the pirate code into legend owes as much to literature as to history. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rise of pirate tales in ballads, pamphlets, and early novels. The publication of a general history of the pirates in 1724, attributed to Captain Charles Johnson, a likely pseudonym, immortalized figures like Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, and Calico Jack. This book, part history and part myth-making, laid the groundwork for the pirate image that would sail through centuries, rebellious, wild, romantic, and dangerously free. It was through these pages that the pirate code began its transformation from harsh maritime law into a mythic charter of freedom. By the time Robert Louis Stevenson penned Treasure Island in 1883, the pirate code had become something else entirely, a symbol of honor among thieves, a secret brotherhood of the sea. Dead men tell no tales, they whispered, and the allure of hidden treasure maps and lost gold stirred imaginations from London to New York. Hollywood would later hoist the black flag higher than ever. Films like Captain Blood, 1935, The Black Swan, 1942, and of course the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise etched the pirate code into modern folklore, though few of these portrayals resembled the brutal realities of actual piracy. In these retellings, the pirate code became less about strict survival and more about freedom, loyalty, and a roguish sense of adventure. But beneath the glittering coins and drunken swordplay, the heart of the code remained a rejection of tyranny, a demand for fairness, a belief that even the lowest born could claim a voice and a share. Even today, this spirit endures in unexpected places. The hacker groups of the digital age, for example, often cite pirate ethics in their defiance of corporate or governmental control. The very term piracy has been co-opted by movements fighting for open information, freedom of speech, and resistance to centralized power. The flag has changed, but the wind that fills its sails is hauntingly familiar. The story of the pirate code, then, is not just a tale of old ships and buried gold. It is the story of human defiance, the refusal to accept the chains imposed by fate, by class, by kings. It is the story of imperfect men who, for a brief moment in history, carved their own laws on the ungovernable sea. As the Royal Fortune glides into legend, its black sails still catch the winds of rebellion. Somewhere deep in the marrow of our myths and memories, the pirate code lives on, not as parchment or ink, but as an idea that freedom, however fleeting, is worth the risk, that fairness must be fought for, and that every man, no matter how lowly, has the right to chart his own course, and perhaps that is the most enduring treasure of all. The Royal Fortune drifted into the endless blue, her hull scarred, her crew silent, save for the rhythmic creak of the rigging and the distant caw of gulls. The men aboard were hardened by sea and storm, but beneath the grit and grime lay a truth too often lost in legend. Pirates were not just thieves and killers, they were survivors of a world that had abandoned them. Men who had seized the wheel of their own destiny through the fragile but vital threads of the pirate code. To understand the heart of piracy, one cannot look only at the grand battles and glittering treasures. You must look at the faces of the people, the outcasts, the broken, the desperate, who created lives within a system so brutal that piracy for many was not savagery, but salvation. This is where the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Red come alive, not as caricatures, but as flesh and blood figures who walked the razor's edge of pirate life. Both women defied not only the laws of kings, but the rigid social prisons of their time. In the early 18th century, a woman's role was dictated from birth: obedience, silence, submission. But Anne and Mary chose instead the freedom of the sea, the brotherhood of the black flag, and the ruthless equality of the pirate code. Anne Bonny, born in Ireland, was fierce, fiery, and unwilling to live in the shadow of any man. When she fled her arranged marriage and joined the crew of Calico Jack Rackham, she found a strange kind of liberty aboard his ship. There, her gender meant nothing. Her skill with blade and pistol earned her place. Mary Red's story was no less extraordinary. Raised as a boy to inherit a family fortune, she spent her early life as a soldier before turning pirate. The two women became legends not only because of their violence, but because they shattered the expectations of their time. The pirate code made no mention of gender. It was concerned only with loyalty, courage, and the equitable division of plunder. On that deck, Anne and Mary stood shoulder to shoulder with their male counterparts, judged not by their sex, but by their valor. This meritocracy, brutal though it was, offered a freedom unavailable in the so-called civilized world. Their ship, the Revenge, followed articles much like those of other pirate crews. Plunder was shared, cowardice was punished, leadership was conditional. And when the British Navy finally cornered them, when Calico Jack's crew was too drunk to fight, it was Anne and Mary who took up arms and fired the cannons alone, defiant to the end. The code demanded it, and they obeyed. Both women were captured, sentenced to hang, but temporarily spared due to pregnancy, a macabre mercy from a system that saw them as anomalies, monsters in petticoats. Their ultimate fates remain murky, but their legend endured, woven forever into the tapestry of pirate lore. This blurring of gender, class, and hierarchy was central to the pirate identity. Ships like the Royal Fortune or the Revenge were not democracies in the modern sense, but they were closer to equality than any other institution of the time. Freed slaves, escaped convicts, and broken sailors stood side by side, judged not by where they came from, but by how they fought, how they contributed, how they honored the code. The pirate havens, Nassau in the Bahamas, Port Royal in Jamaica, and the legendary Madagascar strongholds were crude but radical experiments in freedom. In these salt-worn enclaves, there was no king, no nobleman, no tax collector. There was only the law of the sea and the code that kept men from devouring one another. Nassau for a time was the beating heart of this world, a ragged settlement teeming with ships, cutthroats, and fortune seekers. Known as the Republic of Pirates, Nassau functioned with its own chaotic order. Here, ex-privateers who had turned their backs on European wars gathered under the Jolly Roger, forging a new identity beyond national borders. Ships docked, traded, refitted, alliances were made and broken. The British Empire viewed Nassau as an infection, a disease of lawlessness that had to be purged. Eventually it was. The arrival of Woodes Rogers as governor marked the beginning of the end. Amnesty was offered, gallows were erected. Some pirates accepted the pardon. Others, defiant, were hunted and hanged. But even in destruction, the myth took root, and that myth, over centuries, transformed. The strict codes that governed pirate life were forgotten in favor of more palatable legends, romanticized outlaws, buried treasure, gallant rogues. Hollywood and adventure novels sanitized what was once a brutal, desperate reality. The fact that most pirates lived hard, died young, and clung to their code, not for glory, but for survival. Yet traces of that truth remain. The idea that every man deserves a voice, that leadership is a privilege, not a right, that freedom, however fleeting, is worth the risk. These ideals, tempered by the grim necessity of survival, still ripple through our collective memory. As the sun sank once more beyond the endless sea, the royal fortune, or what remains of her in the ghost stories of time, carried with her not only the weight of blood and plunder, but the quiet legacy of men and women who for a brief moment lived by their own laws. And in that brief flicker of defiance, they carved their names into the bones of the world. As the royal fortune pressed into the dying light, her black sails etched against the blood-orange sky, the deeper layers of piracy began to unfold, not in the glitter of stolen gold, but in the quiet, ruthless realities that tested the very soul of the pirate code. For it is easy to speak of fairness and freedom when the sea is calm and the hold is full. It is in the bitter winds of hardship, betrayal, and fear that the true weight of the code was measured. One such test came in the form of loyalty, fragile as glass aboard ships, where fortune could turn in a heartbeat. The seas were littered with the bones of failed captains, not always slain by cannon or storm, but by the cold steel of mutiny. The code that kept order could also become a noose for those who broke faith. Take the infamous case of Captain Stede Bonnet, known as the Gentleman Pirate, a wealthy landowner who abandoned his comfortable life in Barbados to seek adventure on the seas. Bonnet was ill prepared for the brutal demands of piracy. Though he adopted the trappings, the black flag, the articles, the swagger, his inexperience quickly bred contempt among his men. When his leadership faltered, when his command wavered, it was his own crew who stripped him of power, replacing him with the far more ruthless Blackbeard. Bonnet's eventual capture and execution were almost an afterthought. His fate had been sealed the moment his crew lost faith. In stark contrast stood Edward Teach, Blackbeard, a man who understood the delicate alchemy of fear, respect, and the pirate code better than most. Blackbeard's terror was not born purely from cruelty, but from performance. He wove himself into a legend to maintain control. Slow matches burning in his beard, fearsome displays of violence, but always with the careful hand of a man who knew that chaos, left unchecked, would devour him. His articles, though simple, demanded strict obedience, shared plunder, and readiness for battle at all times. When Blackbeard died, his body riddled with bullets, his head hung from the bowsprit of a Royal Navy ship, the pirate world felt not just the fall of a man, but the collapse of an era. The punishments for breaking the code were equally uncompromising. Marooning, as mentioned before, was not merely execution, it was exile. To be set ashore on a barren rock with a bottle of water and a pistol was to suffer a slow, agonizing descent into madness and death. Yet this punishment was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the ultimate enforcement of the code's sanctity. Steal from your brother, betray the ship, and you lost the right to the society you had sworn to uphold. Such justice was swift because hesitation could mean disaster. Pirates lived in an ecosystem where survival depended on unity. A single act of treachery, a whisper of mutiny, the theft of gold, a coward's retreat in battle, could unravel the fragile order and leave the entire crew vulnerable, not just to the sea but to the noose. When captured, the few pirates who stood trial were often shocked to find that the so-called justice of the empire bore little resemblance to their own. In the courts of London, Boston, or Port Royal, pirates were paraded like animals, judged by men who themselves often profited from war and bloodshed. To the pirates, the gallows was hypocrisy made flesh. Some went to their deaths with defiance. Damnation seize my soul if I give you quarters, or take any from you. Blackbeard is said to have declared, others died silently, knowing that whatever fleeting freedom they had stolen had come, as all things do, with a price. As the hangman's rope tightened, the pirate code did not die with them. It sank into the marrow of history, its ideas dormant, but waiting. The echoes of these seaborne democracies resurfaced in the revolutionary currents that would sweep through Europe and the Americas. Pirates had no manifestos, no political theorists, but their actions spoke volumes against tyranny, against inherited power, against systems where the few devoured the many. The last days of piracy, as the Royal Navy cracked down and pirate strongholds fell, were not marked by epic final battles, but by slow erosion. Pardons were offered, gallows were raised. The vast oceans that once seemed limitless shrank beneath the iron grip of empire. The wild freedom of the pirate brotherhood, that brief and violent experiment in self-rule, faded into legend. But the myths endured. The black flag became a symbol that transcended history, adapted, reinvented, and romanticized. In every rebellion that followed, in every fight against oppression, the spirit of those defiant sailors, those rough men and women who swore to live free or die, cast its shadow. And so, as the Royal Fortune disappears over the darkening horizon, her lanterns flickering in the distance, the true legacy of the pirate code remains, not as a set of brittle rules written in an age long past, but as a testament to the eternal human hunger for liberty, for fairness, and for the right to steer one's own destiny, come what may. Would you like me to now dive into the darker side of pirate life, the tortures, the betrayals, the psychological cost of this existence, or explore more richly detailed accounts of specific raids and treasure hunts that shape the legends we know today? Then, let's bring this long voyage to its rightful end, one last stretch across the restless waters, where the final shadows of the Royal Fortune and the pirate code sink into legend, never to rise again. The winds of change were already howling before the last great pirate ships vanished beneath the tides of history. By the early 1720s, the world's empires, Britain, France, Spain, had grown tired of the havoc wrought by men and women who dared to live by their own rules. The once safe havens of Nassau, Madagascar, and Tortuga, where pirate flags had flown with impunity, now faced the cold steel and burning shot of imperial justice. One by one, the free ports were stamped out, the gallows built high, the black flags torn down. But aboard the decks of ships, like the Royal Fortune, something precious had already been forged, something no empire could kill with a musket ball or sever with a hangman's rope. For what the pirate code truly represented, beneath the salt, the blood, and the smoke, was the fragile possibility of another way, a world where a man's worth was not determined by his birth, but by his courage, his loyalty, and his will to fight for his place among equals. The code had held for as long as it could. It had governed not just the division of gold and silver, but the very survival of pirate communities. When the sea offered only hardship, when the enemy outnumbered and outgunned them, it was this shared bond, the oath of fairness, the promise of equal voice that kept them from turning on one another. It was democracy, stripped to its barest bones, enforced not by idealism, but by necessity. And yet, as history has shown time and again, all golden ages end. The British Empire, determined to wipe piracy from the seas, sent fleets of warships to hunt them down. Famous pirates, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Charles Vane, William Kidd, fell one after another, betrayed, captured, or cornered. The hangman's noose worked overtime in ports from the Caribbean to the English coast, and the once glorious republics of the sea crumbled under the weight of empire. Even the fiercest pirate could not escape the tides of history forever. The Royal Fortune, captained by the infamous Bartholomew Roberts, stood as one of the last and greatest symbols of this defiance. Roberts, a man of iron discipline and strict adherence to the code, had captured over 400 ships in his career. He was no drunkard nor reckless fool. He was a tactician, a leader, and above all a man who believed in the principles that held his crew together. His articles forbade gambling, insisted on cleanliness, and offered compensation for injury. He held his men to standards higher than those of many royal navies. But Roberts, too, met his end in 1722 off the coast of West Africa When the British warship Swallow finally caught him, a single broadside shattered the royal fortune. Roberts was killed instantly, struck by grape shot. His body, at the order of his men, was cast into the sea, so the British would never have the satisfaction of parading his corpse. With him, the last embers of the pirate code flickered and died. The age of pirates was over. And yet, was it truly? For though the ships rotted, the bones of the fallen bleaching on distant shores, the ideas they carried refused to die. The pirate code, the belief in shared power, in chosen leadership, in fairness over tyranny, left ghostly footprints across history. The democratic ideals that would later fuel revolutions in America, France, and beyond found strange echoes in those wind-torn pirate articles. The myth of the pirate, the man or woman who bows to no king, who seizes life by the throat, who chooses freedom even in the face of death, became something larger than life. It was reborn in stories, in legends, in the black flags flown in rebellion after rebellion. The code, though broken, still lived in the hearts of those who refused to be ruled, and so the royal fortune, in truth, never truly sank. She sails still in every tale of adventure, in every whispered dream of escape from oppression, in every heart that beats a little faster at the thought of freedom unchained. The pirate code, battered and bloodied though it was, remains an immortal truth of the human spirit, that even in the darkest corners of the world, men and women will forge laws of their own, will stand together against the weight of thrones, and will die, if they must, with the salt wind in their lungs and the taste of freedom on their lips. The sea, after all, keeps her secrets, and the legends, they never die.